Hi, I'm Robert,
And I'm Evelyn.
and you're listening to Talking About It, Beowulf Edition,
Yes,
Part 2.
part two. Yes. So this is just a quick little bonus episode. So I think it's kind of funny because we're recording this after we just did the Muster of Rohan episode, but this is coming out beforehand. But the episode before and this one actually intertwine a lot.
Right.
Because what this episode is specifically going to be about is the specific influences of Beowulf when it comes to the Rohan culture, and we'll talk a little bit about how it came up with a couple other characters in the Treants as well, but mostly about Rohan.
Right. So, Tolkien knew Beowulf. I mean, he knew it well enough that he's translated it. That's one reason why we're talking about this.
Yes.
And what's really interesting is that even though Beowulf really kind of inspired him to want to write this new mythology for England, and that he was very much uh, inspired by Beowulf, he rarely mentioned how Beowulf influenced him. So what we've been talking about really has been more from scholar studies about it. It's nothing he really said a lot about, other than, he gave that speech about, Beowulf, monsters and critics.
Right.
But that still wasn't about
Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Rings.
But just to kind of dive right into it, the list of supernatural creatures, we have the terms Itennis und Ylfe und Orknas, which translates into English as that he has translated into Entons and elves and demon corpses, which is something that comes up in Lord of the Rings.
But the Orcus word you just used also is where he comes up with orcs.
Yes,
well. Yeah.
It contributes to the orcs, to elves, to Ents, and even like some of other Old English poems mention Otennis and Ilúfe, so which are Entons and elves, and it's a lot.
Yeah. And then what's really interesting also is because of his connection with Beowulf and his connection with other cultures, because of what has been learned about Europe and their cultures and their histories and their myths and their legends from World War One, that he realizes that England does not really have a set of myths.
Mm-hmm.
And so, so in his letters, he writes about that he wanted to dedicate some mythology for
Right.
England.
And that's what we just talked about while recording the last episode that's going to come out after this episode, because we did this totally the right way, is that even when writing this last chapter and writing about the Rohan, whenever he's writing about the Rohan, it's in that kind of the saga-esque kind of way about it that Beowulf kind of has, where it's like just the style of writing is very similar in itself, where he borrows from that as well. And then you get the writers of Rohan themselves. That's what we are really going to talk about today, is their entire culture comes from this kind of culture. And even their names, Eomer and Hama, are characters from Beowulf. Eowyn is literally translated to horse joy. And Theoden is king. So we have that kind of stuff.
You mean Theodore?
Yes, Theodore. If you yeah, we mispronounce some stuff in the next episode. Just warning y'all now. But talking about how they are the Ilthiod, the horse people, and the Ilred, the troops of cavalry, and the people of Earl, which is just horse people. Like, all of that is stuff that's mentioned in Beowulf and other Old English stories. Um, there's even a line in Lord of the Rings, which is "Long live King Theoden," which is hilarious because in Beowulf, a couple things that they scream is "Long live King Hrothgar," which is the king in Beowulf. And
that's a very loose connection because
no, it's even like I'm quoting from Alaric Hall, where it's a considered a scholarly joke because because in the Beowulf the king is literally Theoden, and Theoden literally means king, and so it's the exact same wording.
okay, but for ages and ages and cultures across the world have always said "Long live the king."
Okay.
But what you're saying about the little joke about Theoden, instead of they don't say "Long live the king," they say "Long live Theoden,"
Which is long live
which
the king.
means the same thing. Yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah,
that's the thing.
yeah. And then so Tolkien says when he wrote this, he wanted the feel of the air, the climate, even the soil of England to be palatable,
Hmm.
in this,
Yeah.
in Lord of the Rings.
And that's something that we kind of see is like we see in the Rohan their great halls. Like in Beowulf, we have the great halls of these warriors. Um, we see that these monsters. We're gonna get into monsters like a fully in another episode, but we have like trolls and orcs and goblins mentioned and is kind of taken. And even one of my favorite characters from The Hobbit, Bjorn, is also means bear, like Beowulf.
Well, yeah, and we also get a connection to Gollum.
Which again, well, that's going to be a whole nother
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's what I
like
mean. Yeah,
thing itself.
which I thought it was when I read that today. I went, I don't see it.
Oh, believe me, we're gonna do a deep dive into Grendel versus Gollum. We're gonna do a deep dive into Grendel versus Gollum.
And so just one last note. I want to say, this is a quote directly out of uh, Tolkien's letters. He says the cycles, meaning the stories, should be linked into a majestic whole and yet leave scope for other minds, hands, welding paint, music, and drama to add to.
Mm-hmm.
So, so not only, you know, yes, he wrote Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, but there's all that other background stuff that he wrote.
He created
he,
his
he, he created
he created myths for this mythological world.
Yeah, so everything we're reading about is taking place in the Third Age,
Mm-hmm.
but he wrote about the creation of the world in the First Age and the Second Age,
Yeah,
and how everything today in Middle Earth relates
back to what before.
happened before.
Yeah.
So
He's basically just an interdimensional time traveler who's just writing about his old home. That's what I've decided.
yeah, I think both he and C.S. Lewis might have been Time Lords.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Time Lords that met and they're just like, oh, let's compare notes.
Yes.
But another thing that was really similar with Rohan is the war horns that we see of Rohan and of Gondor. Where that's something we see in Beowulf, where that culture is used, where these war horns are used as rallying cries, as a way to scare the enemy as well as to bolster the allies.
Well, I'm trying. Oh yeah, here it is. There. What's really interesting? There's a series of books where the first book is called Here There Be Dragons,
Yes.
and it's written by James A. Owen. The very base of this story is that the Inklings and some of the other famous sci-fi and fantasy writers of England at that same time, they didn't make all this stuff up. They were pulled into this other world, and they're basically reporting back what they saw.
Okay.
And it's a really interesting series of books. Um, well, I guess that's it.
No,
One more thing. Okay.
I actually have one more thing. So something else that we have is we have these kind of a similarities of Beowulf to both Frodo and Aragorn.
Okay.
Where we take Beowulf versus fairy tales to Aragorn and Frodo. Where with Beowulf we have this bold hero who is victorious in his very first battle that we see. And he becomes the king of his own people. And we see that in Aragorn becoming the king. And unlike other fairy tales, Beowulf doesn't exactly have a happy ending, which we kind of see in Frodo, where Frodo he sets out not knowing where he's going, like kind of a small beginnings kind of fairy tale kind of thing, but in the end he kind of is defeated by this temptation in this ring, and he is disillusioned after his quest, to the point where he goes with the elves out. And I thought that that was just a very interesting thing that people kind of had noted prior to the similarities with it.
Yeah. Um,
Anything else?
I think that's it.
All right. Well, I've been Evelyn.
And I've been Robert.
And we're talking about it.